Well, thank you, Sasha, for coming. I think
Thanks.
the last time we had you here
right.
was with this book.
Yeah.
Which was probably about 10 years ago.
Yeah, that came out in the fall of 2012.
Victory Lane.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, it was working on that in over the course of 2011 that sort of brought me to this topic. I just had all these conversations with pollsters or people who were, measured public opinion in some form or another, who told me they'd never seen attitudes on a single issue the way that they had moved on marriage. And that just struck me as this really interesting puzzle that I wanted to unlock. And I did not expect it would take me 10 years to do it when I started in on that.
Well, it's a very comprehensive book.
Thank you.
A lot of meat and potatoes inside that. And you're right about the fact that the issue really went from the unimaginable to the normal. And we saw that here where presidential candidates would be speaking, and this would be part of what they would be talking about in the negative. And certainly that has evolved, and now we see that it's just part of the culture.
Yeah. And I think like you could see even within, just thinking about New Hampshire here, like one primary season, John Huntsman runs in a Republican primary in 2012 as a supporter of civil unions. And that's a huge outlier position within the Republican primary in late 2011, early 2012. You have a sitting governor of a state and a conservative state who's now running for president, supporter of civil unions. By 2016, obviously, the Supreme Court has ruled that marriage equality is the law of the land, and it's barely coming up by primary 6 months, 7 months after that landmark Supreme Court ruling. It barely comes up in the debates here. It is not a focus of candidate speeches. And so, just in that compact period of time, you just see a huge center of gravity shift within one party.
And you're right about 2016. We never saw Trump really bring it up during that primary. Obviously, he was sort of the focus, the bright light during that primary that people were focused in on. And I think that there was one point where Ted Cruz went down to a state to hassle a town clerk or something.
Yeah, there were these small moments in that primary, which, in retrospect, one of the questions that I deal with ultimately in the epilogue of the book. The book ends, at the Supreme Court, this landmark decision. And then there's I expected I would spend a lot more time after that trying to make sense of backlash and fallout. And I think it's in part because I had read, all the books about other landmark Supreme Court decisions, Brown v. Board, Roe v. Wade, that catalyzed political opposition in their wake. And I assumed it was inevitable that if the court did this, that something like that would happen. And one of the big stories that I tried to deal with at the end is, why didn't it happen? Why did this disappear from our politics so quickly after being so intense for so long? And a big part of that story is simply that I think Donald Trump personally was not interested in it. Trump has, let's just say, a remarkable gift for finding ways to pit Americans against one another on identity lines. And he spent that primary season, doing it on the basis of religion and ethnicity and national origin and gender. You probably could come up with other contributions to this if you want, but, say what you will about Donald Trump, he does not seem terribly judgmental about people's marriages or who they have sex with. And we can expound afterwards about why we think that might be, but he chose not to make this an issue in that primary campaign, and the other 16 or 17 Republicans, because they were basically following his lead, realized pretty quickly that's not where the news was. So yeah, there was that episode about 6 weeks after the Supreme Court decision where Kim Davis, who was a county clerk in Kentucky, I believe a Pentecostal, said that it violated her religious beliefs to issue marriage licenses, as county clerks in Kentucky are required to do under law. And she went to jail very briefly for it. And Ted Cruz, Mike Huckabee, and Rick Santorum all went down and did a rally to support her. And it just didn't really get any traction in the news because Trump didn't take the bait. And so, I think that this issue might have played out very differently if Donald Trump had decided he was going to make rallying backlash to the Supreme Court part of his campaign. One of the things, but we get to the fall of 2016, so now 18 months after landmark Supreme Court decision, 3 presidential debates, 1 vice presidential debate, including Mike Pence, who has built a significant part of his career around being a vocal opponent of LGBT rights broadly. And the question of same-sex marriage or the Obergefell decision does not come up once in those 6 hours of debates.
That's amazing. And, the other thing with some of the other issues that you mentioned, or getting into like women's suffrage, some of the issues that we dealt in the 50s is that we didn't have TV either, or social media. And I think, you look at some of these television shows, Modern Family, where all of a sudden this is in everybody's, living room, and they're not being offended by what they're seeing, and they're saying it's okay. Part of politics is figuring out that the people are okay with something, and so therefore you're not going to try to demonize it, which is what the Republicans did. And I think to some degree, don't you think that they sort of overreached in using the issue and found out that there was nothing there when they were trying this in the 2000s with the Defense of Marriage Act?
Yeah, so I think in sort of 2 separate ways overreach. One, I think there's just a basic part of this story is filled with stories of unintended consequences, and consistently, and sometimes it takes years, if not decades, to see this play out, where there's simple strategic miscalculations that you see. So, marriage in American history has been almost entirely a matter reserved for the states, with only rare exceptions in our history, right? So there was, during what they called the polygamy crisis in the late 19th century, Congress basically said, if you want to become a state, you have to basically ban polygamy. There were efforts to standardize divorce laws in the early 20th century. The Supreme Court ruled that in 1967 that state bans on interracial marriage or the use of racial qualifications in marriage was unconstitutional. These are very rare exceptions, and by and large, states have a lot of leeway to determine qualifications for who gets married and what the process is. So when Congress, led by Republican members, but with a lot of Democratic votes, in 1996 passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which said that under federal law, the federal government will not recognize same-sex marriages, even if they're legally commemorated by a state. They were taking something that would have remained in the states and turned it into a federal issue. At the time, it did not seem like there was any political cost for that. Bill Clinton signed it into law. It did not, it was not it was controversial, but not on like conventional partisan lines. And what you see later is that allows this issue to come before the Supreme Court. It gets written into federal law, and instead of this playing out in state courts, which is probably the arc that this would have taken, all the early cases that the gay rights litigators were filing in the 1990s and early 2000s were in state courts under state constitutions. It was conservatives who took the lead writing this into federal law and opening this up as something that could go to the Supreme Court. And then the other thing is they take something that had been, in this case, written in federal statute as the Defense of Marriage Act, and then 8 years later is an effort to pass a federal marriage amendment. And so they've taken something that's just sort of a federal statutory question and tried to constitutionalize it. And you see that they elevate this debate to places where they, as public opinion moves, can no longer control it or win it. I think on this sort of cultural front, the big overreach was sort of rhetorical, which is, a huge turning point is May 17th, 2004. That's the day that Massachusetts becomes the first state in the US to let same-sex couples legally marry. And up until that point, opponents of same-sex marriage basically could make any possible claim about what would happen if we change this bedrock definition of American family, right? And some people I think were sincere in their fear of this, new form of organizing families. And I think some people were probably intentionally hyperbolic, but you had, claims like this is going to be the end of Western civilization as we know it. I think that's a Rick Santorum quote. This is going to be the end of the American family. Some of those were on their face absurd, but they were non-falsifiable. And you could sort of claim we've never done this before. And, we're going to open Pandora's box and
only some, if I recall
Yeah.
correctly, there was one country,
yeah.
Sweden at that point.
So
Experiments have been
2000.
tried in only
Yeah, so
one country.
2003. So the Massachusetts court rules in November 2003, and orders then gives basically 6 months for town. It's like New Hampshire town clerks have to take the lead on this stuff. So give them 6 months. At that point, the Netherlands has legalized same-sex marriage. You start to have some Canadian provinces, but Belgium is on its way. But no, this is a rare experiment, and I think people had many people had a sincere fear of the new and untried, and there were these wild claims, and and then midnight comes, and town hall in Cambridge, Massachusetts opens at midnight, and so that at the first available minute, couples can go get married, and they waive the normal waiting period, and it turns into almost like a street fair outside of City Hall in Cambridge. And there's one protester holding a sign there that I quote in the book, which I found not just amusing but fairly prescient for activist sign makers, which was "See Chicken Little, the sky didn't fall." And I think it really captured how the debate changed after 2004, which was, okay, fine, you could claim that crazy stuff will happen afterwards, but now we're in this new world, and opponents of same-sex marriage looked everywhere for evidence that there were actually negative impacts, not just in these European countries that had tried it, but now you had in Massachusetts, and then 3 years later in Connecticut. And the fact was that people who were, delving into the deepest data could find no difference in how children performed in school, whether or not they were in married gay couples. There were no higher rates of divorce. There was no obvious, you guys are close enough to Massachusetts. I know people in New Hampshire have some strong opinions about Massachusetts. I think it'd be very hard to ascribe any sort of big societal decay to what happened between like 2004 and onward. And I think that's, so you have this cultural change, pop culture change, that, Will and Grace, Ellen, stuff like that. But then you also had a Modern Family. But then you also just had like the real life change, which is like gay couples were able to marry, and the opponents could not generate examples of anything meaningful that was being affected in the lives of others, while the circle of people who were positively affected by this change in law grew, right? So not just individual gays and lesbians who can now get married or could aspire to build families on an equal legal footing to straight couples, but also their families and their communities who had an interest in the stability that came along with that. Their employers and their labor unions, which like the predictability of knowing what types of benefits people are going to get through the state or through their relationships, as opposed to having to meet. And so the circle of people who were invested in this just grew as it became real, and the circle of people who were pulled to the opposition out of fear alone, I think, disappeared.
So you mentioned the states. I think that the fascinating thing about this book is really how lucky the entire organization and movement was in the beginning, that really created the domino effect for the rest of this, that this early action in Hawaii is really luck. You have the new Supreme Court people that you highlight in the book. I think you said that they had an average of 3 years experience on the court. And then you have the overall luck of the activists themselves just getting in a little bit of an argument.
Yeah. So the book starts in Hawaii in 1990, basically. And it's fundamentally a story of this guy named Bill Woods, who's like the gay activist in Hawaii in the 1970s and 80s.
Did you ever get to meet him?
I did not. He passed away in 2008 or 9, a few years before I started working on this. So I spent some time with his husband. They married in Canada before they died. I got a hold of a lot of his personal papers and spent a bit of time with his friends and allies, but I did not get, he was one of the, I got almost every one of the major figures in this book is still alive, and I got to spend a bit of time with most of them, and he was the one that I did not get to meet. He, like many, I think, first generation activists in any community movement, he was incredibly entrepreneurial. He founded the Gay Community Center in Honolulu, the gay newspaper. He had the first gay themed radio show. Not terribly good at working in coalition or partnership with other people, but quite good at.
Which probably was the reason why he did this.
Yeah, but very good at creating new things and getting attention for them. And he ends up in this really petty fight for control of a pride planning committee in 1989. Oahu, the most populous island in Hawaii, has had at this point fairly modest Pride Month festivities. They've had this picnic and vigil every June. And Bill Woods gets on the committee that plans this thing, and he says, I want to do a parade. And there are 2 lesbian women who run the committee, and they do not want to do a parade for a variety of reasons. Some of which are that a parade is like very complicated, and it's a lot more complicated than putting on a picnic, and they're not sure they can handle. And the other reason is that they really don't like Bill Woods because they've just launched a monthly gay and lesbian magazine that now competes with his gay newspaper for what you can only imagine is the very large pool of advertisers who want to be in LGBT publications in Hawaii in 1989. And so they have this like just, personal animosity. And so this very quickly devolves into like every bad event planning committee experience you've been through. But they tell Woods, okay, fine, we'll create a subcommittee for you to explore the possibility of having a parade. So Woods calls around to big cities on the mainland that have organized pride parades and puts together a report on how you put together a parade. And they say, we still don't want to do the parade. So he leaves the pride planning group and starts his own pride parade and rally council. And now he's looking for every possible way that he can have his event upstage the picnic and vigil. That's the sort of traditional thing. So he asks the governor to be the grand marshal of his parade. He gets the Royal Hawaiian Jazz Band to agree to perform. He has a friend who's a chef and caterer who will put on an international food festival. And he decides that there's going to be a kind of Mooney-style mass wedding on the rally stage at the end of the parade. And there was a church, a national church called the Metropolitan Community Church, a sort of non-denominational, gay-friendly church that had been having these holy union ceremonies where couples exchange commitment vows, but nobody had any expectation that there was legal force behind this. And his idea was that he would get some of these couples and they would reenact a wedding on stage. And Bill Woods was not a lawyer and very clearly misread the state's family law statute and came away with the misguided impression that because Hawaii law does not in every place say that there has to be one husband and one wife, that maybe if he sued, the state would have to recognize these couples as married. And so he goes to the state affiliate of the ACLU and says, hey, if this becomes a legal issue, will you back me up? And the ACLU does not want to have any part of this.
Which is amazing in itself.
Yeah, so the ACLU,
there's no other organization really that you could go to for that.
At this point, the ACLU is like, they have, there are a few national gay rights organizations, but the ACLU has committed itself to protecting the rights of sexual minorities. It has, it is one non-gay organization that has made a priority out of taking on these cases. But they also actually have lawyers there, and they read state law and thought that what Wood, thing Wood saw as like this loophole was not something that you could build a case around. And then I think they just had a real fear of partnering with this guy that they thought was a loose cannon. And so, but they also, it's clear that the ACLU knows they don't want to get on board with this project, but they also don't want to say no to him because they don't want to get into a fight with him because they know that he'll enjoy it. And so the first half of 1990, the ACLU is basically just trying to like pawn him off and slow him down. We need to check with the main office in New York. They say we need to consult with these law professors. The law professors say we have to look up these precedent cases. And it's so clear what they're doing. It's just trying to get past June with the idea that Woods will have his parade and then he won't have the wedding because he won't have figured out the legal stuff, and then he'll move on to, short attention span bill will move on to like his next project. And June comes and goes, and he has his parade, and now Bill Woods is pissed that the ACLU is disrespecting him. And they go back and forth a little longer. And December 17th, 1990, he decides he's going to force the ACLU's hand by putting out a press release saying that he's going to bring couples to the Hawaii Public Health Department to request marriage licenses. And he shows up on Monday morning with 3 couples, 2 female, 1 male. Basically, the entirety of the Honolulu press corps is there. They go in and they request their marriage licenses. The state public health director says, I need to get an opinion from the attorney general about this. I can't give you these licenses now without it. And Woods' idea is, okay, well, the ACLU can blow me off in private, fine, but they can't possibly, this organization that's committed itself to these, to defending this disadvantaged group of people cannot possibly say no once there are actual real people asking to be represented by them. And certainly if he comes with a bunch of cameras and notebooks behind him, it'll jam the ACLU. They'll have to take this case. So brings the couples over there. ACLU still wants nothing to do with this. And they get handed over to a guy who is like the civil rights attorney in Honolulu the next month. And in May of 1991, he sues the state on what he totally acknowledges is a long shot lawsuit, arguing that under the state constitution, the couples have the right to be married. And what Neil's pointing to is that there's this, in the summer of 1992, a bunch of just wild things happen on the Hawaii Supreme Court, which has 5 members. The Chief Justice dies, the next justice hits mandatory retirement age, the 3rd justice, who would replace one of the others, had heard this case at a lower level and had to recuse himself. And so over the course of a couple of months in the summer of 1992, the average age of the Hawaii Supreme Court goes down 20 years. You get this, it becomes a majority non-WASP court, which in 1990 was.
So it's the
generation changes,
it's
and
an important part of the entire.
absolutely, yeah. And so you get sort of more culturally liberal younger judges. You get combination of Jewish, Catholic, and but one of the things that's interesting about Hawaii is just the absolute, even as evangelicals are becoming more influential in politics in the rest of the country, just really not present there. And the court in May of 1993, the shock of everybody involved, becomes the first court on earth to rule that the fundamental right to marriage could extend to same-sex couples.
And when they made the argument, they didn't say that it would be a federal infringement of federal, which was a key point because they didn't want the justices to think that they might be overruled.
So this is really important. So, and this actually goes back to the ACLU. So the ACLU in 1985, 86 had gone before the US Supreme Court to challenge state bans on sodomy, which were basically a number of states had laws dating back to the early 19th century that forbid private consensual sex among gay people, and sometimes certain types of sex among straight people too. And there's a case in Georgia where two guys were in the bedroom in one's apartment. Police came in on some other issue, found them in bed together, charged one of them with violating this state sodomy statute, criminal charges, and the ACLU sued all the way up to the Supreme Court on the basis that the right to privacy that the court had acknowledged in the contraception cases and then had affirmed in Roe v. Wade would extend to couples having adult couples having private consensual sex. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1986 that states did in fact have the ability to criminalize gay sex because expressing moral disapproval was a compelling interest for the state to do this. And that was a real shock to anybody who did gay rights law. They thought that this would be something that would fall and that would open up all sorts of other opportunities under the law. And when the Supreme Court decided in 1986, hey, states are free to basically treat gay behavior as criminally sanctionable, it sent the message that you didn't want to go into federal court on anything, because anything that got up to the Supreme Court, how are you going to win any other recognition of gay or lesbian citizenship if the courts have determined that the act that defines you as a person in this category is potentially criminal? And so there was this huge shift, and the Supreme Court ended up overturning that 1986 opinion and decision in 2003 in another case from Texas. But during that period, the message is clear for people who want to file gay rights cases: stay out of federal court, because this is one really big unfriendly precedent, and if you go up to the Supreme Court, that's a place you're going to lose. And so the focus is on state courts, and so this case in Hawaii was filed under the basis of the Hawaii Constitution, which happened to have been like a quirk of Hawaii being a young state is that they wrote their constitution in the late 50s and they kept amending it with the Constitutional Convention in the 1970s. And so there's a lot of stuff that 18th and 19th century state constitutions don't have that Hawaii has. And one of them is a provision that they took the Equal Rights Amendment, the federal amendment that never was passed, but was never ratified, right? This is what Mrs. America is about for those of you who get your recent history from streaming services. They basically said you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, which never made it into the U.S. Constitution, but Hawaii just put that language wholesale into their constitution. And the same thing happens in a different version of it in Vermont, where another case is filed a few years later. Vermont has an idiosyncratic clause in its state constitution that dates back from the Republic of Vermont, which says that the state has to afford equal benefits to people in the law. It was intended to get rid of any traces of monarchy or royal privileges under a British system where different people could get different privileges based on their status under the law. They wrote this equal benefits clause. I don't think any other state has it, but when lawyers went to sue in Vermont, they used this to say that you cannot give equal benefits. And Massachusetts similarly has it. And so part of this early game, basically from the perspective of litigators, was not just looking for states that had a liberal judiciary, where a legislature might not get involved and amend the Constitution, but where there were particular provisions in state constitutions that you can use to win this right in the state court that you would not be able to leverage into federal court. But also it meant that when you win, your opponents cannot appeal it anywhere.
So after Hawaii, all of a sudden, some conservatives figure out that this is an issue, as I think the great quote in here from Don Nichols that you put in your book is, they rally better than abortion. And so they figure out that this is something that the base of the party, that they can go out and sort of demonize and go out and raise money and potentially win elections based upon this issue. So that starts to take off about the mid-90s.
Yeah, so the Defense of Marriage Act gets introduced, and Don Nichols is the Senate co-sponsor of it. Bob Dole, whose picture I just saw somewhere up here, was the other. And I think that, yes, they see political opportunity in this. In this case, they see the opportunity really to squeeze Democrats, both in Congress and Bill Clinton in an election year in 1996, by forcing him to sign a bill that will either, have him take what they think of as a position that will be unpopular with persuadable voters, or that'll antagonize a key part of his base, and what by then has become a significant part of the Democratic activist and fundraising infrastructure, the gay community. But they also, I think, compared to abortion, see this as a place where they can be on the front foot defining laws, because there isn't a kind of controlling precedent the way there was around Roe and then around Casey in the early 90s. And so they write into federal law, they start amending state constitutions. Ultimately, 35 or 36 states amend their constitutions to ban same-sex marriage. Those are the cases that ultimately go to the Supreme Court in 2015. And then you have this effort to pass a federal marriage amendment, to write into the U.S. Constitution, which makes, you've read your Constitution, it says nothing about family structure anywhere in there. For the first time, it would have written a definition of family into the Constitution, which is to say that the only marriage that's recognized in the United States is between a man and a woman. And that doesn't go as far as the Equal Rights Amendment, but it gets a majority in the Senate. It doesn't get a super majority. It passes the House. And I think that's part of the reason that the conservative activists saw opportunity in this, is that, so much of what they were doing on abortion was in the 90s was sort of, they were not driving the debate. And here they could sort of drive the terms of the debate.
And so at the same time, when the right is sort of demonizing and sort of mobilizing their base, some of these state courts are starting to sort of change the rules. So the interesting thing that I also thought about and that I learned in the book was that the courts really are the things that are moving. It's not politicians, even in states like New York or Vermont, where it's much more liberal, it's courts. And tell us about where all of a sudden that changes, and where some of the money from like Singer and things like that, and what the influence of that is.
Yeah, so early on, the ask, so in what happens in Hawaii is the Supreme Court rules, and then conservatives mobilize, led by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, in coalition with local Catholics, mobilize to ultimately pass a constitutional amendment that takes this out of the hands of the courts in Hawaii. And then as these cases are filed in other states, in Vermont and in Massachusetts and Connecticut, what gay rights activists are asking politicians is just stay out of this. They get better at meeting with them before these cases are filed. They don't want, but they're not saying, we don't want you to do anything. They say, we think we have a very good case going into court. We think we can win there. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a backlash and opposition once we get some wins in court, and people are going to come to you and ask you to try to change the constitution of given state. And all we want you to do, friendly legislators, friendly governor, whatever, is sit on your hands and say, we want the process to play out in the courts. And that works in some of these states. In many others, the 36 or whatever I mentioned, that end up passing constitutional amendments, it doesn't work. That starts to turn after 2009. That's the first place in Vermont, the first place where a state legalizes marriage through the political process. And part of what's happening, and then the next year, 2 years later, happens in New York. New York State becomes really important. It's the first large state to do this through the political process. And what's happened that makes that possible is that there is a cluster of Republican donors who emerge. And Paul Singer is a sort of main character in this story. He's a hedge fund guy, a sort of is one of the largest donors to Republican conservative causes in the United States. A sort of, down the line, Paul Ryan conservative, you'd probably say, on every issue except one, which is LGBT rights, because he had a, I believe, college age at the time son who came out as gay. And so, conservative Paul Singer has decided that, he wants to protect Israel and lower taxes and deregulate a whole lot of stuff, and is highly invested in letting gays and lesbians marry. And so he gets a few other sort of Wall Street buddies, also sort of big conservative donor types, to buy into this. And they, when Andrew Cuomo comes to office in early 2011, he has basically said he wants us to be one of the first things he accomplishes through the legislature. And a big,
didn't really trust him at the time,
yeah, I mean,
but he did say
a lot of times change. A lot of people didn't really trust Andrew Cuomo. I think he's incredibly risk averse as a politician. Sort of this was seen as a very risky thing to do for a Democrat in 2011, that you're going to come into office and make one of your first
10 years.
Just 10 years ago, this guy who wanted to run for president as a kind of, sensible, moderate Democrat. This was seen as an unusual position to stake out. And he certainly did not want to put his name and weight behind this in the first months of administration if he thought he was going to lose. And ultimately the balance of power in the New York State Senate was held by Republicans. And they needed a handful of Republican votes. There was opposition from, there had been opposition from a handful of religious Black and Latino Democrats from New York City who opposed same-sex marriage. And so they weren't even getting all the Democratic votes, and they had to pick up a bunch of Republican votes. And so Paul Singer comes in and basically tells, working with the gay groups that are sort of leading the advocacy on this issue, they build into their lobbying strategy, we're not just going to keep Cuomo and the Democratic leaders focused on this by letting them know that we're invested in this, but we are going to go to the Republican legislators we think we can peel off and tell them the thing you're afraid of is a primary voting if you were to vote for this. And we want you to know that some of the largest Republican donors in the country will have your back if you and your random upstate district get primaried by somebody over this vote. And we're in 2011 now, right? So Barack Obama is opposed to same-sex marriage. Most national Democrats of any significance are opposed to same-sex marriage. This ends up being certainly helps turn the tide in New York. They get 3 Republican state senators who vote for the bill. They end up using similar strategy with a lot of the same donors here in Concord over the next following year.
A lot of money spent.
A lot of money spent, and very similarly to try to build sort of support among obviously the base of this is coming from Democratic votes, but the idea that Republican money can buck up Republicans who would be afraid of the consequences of this. And what you see is in the overall shift, it sort of goes back to that kind of huntsman to trajectory, is that one of the things that's happening within Republican politics in that sort of 5-year period from like 2011 to 2016 is the donor class is more liberal on this by and large than the activist class is. And you get a lot of Republican politicians, elected officials, state and federal, who they are not going to come out and support same-sex marriage in 2012, 2013, but they also do not want to be the face of opposition the way people were rushing to do 5-10 years earlier. And a lot of that is a sort of calculation that the big donors who fund campaigns are on the other side of this issue. And I think that makes it, one of the things that sort of happened, there was polling this summer, it was Gallup or Pew or something, that showed for the first time Republicans, nationally, voters have 50% support for same-sex marriage. And some of the reason that's happened, I think, is that this issue did not polarize the way that other issues have in the last 10 years. And some of that's because Republican elected officials, especially ones in Congress, stayed as quiet as they possibly could on this for as long as they possibly could. And we're not sending sort of elite signals to voters and activists that this is an important priority for the party. And I think that money was sort of catalyzing a lot of that early on.
We might have a problem with your mic, so I want to check that. But one of the biggest sort of discussion points when you read this book is this period where Obama, is sort of teetering about whether or not he's going to say anything about this and switch his position. And all of a sudden, Joe Biden goes on a television show and gets, ahead of his skis and sort of says that he's for something that the president hasn't announced that he's for, which is a very awkward and unusual situation in American politics that would happen. One of his cabinet secretaries does as well. You highlight that in the book. But it seems more of a mistake. The way you wrote about it, seems more of a mistake than it was Biden sort of doing a calculated, I'm going to say something about this, either to draw the boss in or to make sure that the people in the audience know where I am.
Yes.
So it was more of a mistake.
Yeah. So this was the era where our concern was that Joe Biden was saying too much as opposed to, so basically, to put this in some context, Obama had decided that he was going to publicly change his position on marriage when Biden did this in May of 2012. And that had been in the works for about 9 months within the White House. So sort of ties into the last story. So the New York State Senate votes in June of 2011 to legalize marriage. Cuomo signs the bill that night. And Obama ends up just a couple of weeks later in New York for a couple of fundraisers, one of which for the DNC, one of which is an LGBT themed fundraiser on Broadway. And he gets heckled at this dinner over his opposition to same-sex marriage. So he's now getting heckled by people who've paid whatever amount of money for Barack Obama in New York City, from people who've paid thousands of dollars to be at a dinner for him. At the same time that liberal activists are swooning over bold Andrew Cuomo, and it really ticks Obama off. And he realizes he's now, I think he'd been incredibly cagey and strategic about his position on same-sex marriage over the years, and now he realizes he's fundamentally out of sync with his party. And he comes back to, I quote a senior White House advisor, I think by name, but I can't remember now, so I'm just gonna say a senior White House advisor, saying he felt like the skunk at the garden party, I think is the line I have in there. He comes back to the White House and basically says, I'm ready to change my position on marriage, but you guys, political advisors, have to figure out how we're going to do this. And that's not easy, right? I mean, if you're a state legislator or county executive or state treasurer, you could probably change your position on a whole bunch of things and people never pick up on it. If you're president and you've been asked, hundreds, thousands of times your position on this issue, they knew that he was going to have to sort of tell a story about how and why he was changing when he did. And so the questions were sort of when and how. The how, there was some talk within the White House about he should give a big speech the way he did on race in Philadelphia during the 2008 campaign. There was a fear that would draw too much attention to it. And they sort of, alighted on the conclusion that he should do this in an interview. There was some research that suggested that a female interviewer was better than a male interviewer to discuss this issue in terms of moving public opinion. I have not yet seen research on 4 female interviewers being better than 1, but they decided he was going to do this on The View. And then the question was when, and basically they wanted to do it before the re-election in November of 2012. They wanted to do it early enough. They thought there would be sort of net upside for him politically if he did this before the re-election in terms of helping with fundraising, helping with enthusiasm among Democratic activists. But they also did not want to make it a focal point of the campaign. They wanted to run against Mitt Romney's going to shut down your factories and whatever. And so the question became, so they didn't want to do it in the fall because they didn't want it to sort of become a major focus of the debates. They didn't want to do it too close to the conventions. And so they're sort of moving it up into the calendar and finding a place where it's not going to interfere with other sort of priorities as they try to make this election about the economy. And the ultimate plan is that in June, he's going to be in New York for some fundraisers, and they'll put him on The View then, and they'll tee up this question. And my reporting is that Biden was aware of the general contours of this plan, but not the particular timing of it. He and Obama were having weekly lunches at the time, and I think he knew that this had been a sort of ongoing thing. So he gets asked on Meet the Press in early May of 2012 if his position on marriage has changed, and he gives an answer that, go home and watch it on YouTube or find the transcript. I dare you to, read it and feel like you have 100% certainty that you know what he's trying to say, because the sentence doesn't really scan. It's not entirely clear whether he's saying he believes a change in the law or it's just. And Biden's own staff isn't sure after he gives this answer, in which he says, I think, a man and a woman should be whatever. They don't know if he's actually said anything that's functionally different than what he said before, which is basically every national Democrat for a decade have been saying, I think marriage is between a man and a woman, but I think gays and lesbians should have all the same rights and benefits as other couples. And so there's some question, did he actually make news? The whole world thinks he made news. And by Monday morning, it's pretty clear that the media is treating this as a statement of a different policy position than Obama has.
And to be fair to Biden, if he had shut it down immediately, and then a few weeks later, Obama changes his position, which he knows is going to happen.
Yeah.
He looked like an outlier.
Yeah, I mean, in retrospect, there are probably ways for him to say, the president's position. The president's been pretty clear about what his position is on this, and we both, I mean, I think there are probably, that a vice president with a sort of Pence-like focus on not getting in the boss's way on anything might have found an answer that served the short-term interest, but. Biden sort of got into storytelling mode. He started talking about it's his grandkids watching Will and Grace. It meandered. That's Biden when he used to meander. So anyway, the White House press secretary gets asked at the briefing on Monday, in 41 questions or something, that are all some version of the vice president disagrees with the president on this, right? And the White House answer is no, what they said, there's no difference between what they said. And nobody's buying that. And it's clear after a day that this is not going to go away, because the impression is that they have different positions. And one of two things is true. Either Joe Biden is, the vice president's out shooting his mouth off about a position that's different than the president's, and the president's okay with that because he's weak and being, can't keep his vice president in line, or the vice president is floating a trial balloon to test whether the president is going to change his views, in which case people are going to keep on asking about it until you've heard from the president on it. There's no good way to live in a world where on a sort of hot button issue that the world has decided that they have two positions. It's sort of unsustainable. So Wednesday morning, Obama basically says, I'm ready to do this. And they call ABC News and say, is Robin Roberts available? And she comes down that afternoon and they give an interview. And he says basically what I believe he would have said 5 weeks later, 6 weeks later in New York. And so, it became a source of people in the White House who felt protective of Obama, notably Valerie Jarrett, felt incredibly betrayed by what Biden did. I do not think that any of them ascribe it to either malice or strategy. I think that they saw it as like a lack of discipline that nonetheless was, undermined Obama and, frustrated them. But the thing that has changed, though, is I think that really that played an important role. And this is interesting now just because he's president. If he were a retired vice president, I don't think this would be in the least bit interesting to anybody. But I think it changed Biden's conception of himself, which is this became seen in certainly in the LGBT community and also among a just subsection of sort of progressive activist elite as like one of Biden's great, achievements, that he helped push Obama along on this. And when he ran for president when he launches his campaign in early 2019, it wasn't entirely clear that Joe Biden had a base anywhere in the Democratic Party. And we later saw that he had incredible strength among African-American voters. But if you had to say in early 2019, like, where is the real support for Biden in the Democratic Party? Where's the real enthusiasm from? I'd say basically like firefighters and gay donors. And gay donors still took this event in 2012 as a reason that they felt this real warmth for Biden. A lot of that second term was him basically doing a victory lap on this to gay rights groups that had never really, he'd always been incredibly good about not sticking his neck out on issues of certainly sexual politics in the Democratic Party. And he clearly felt he grew into the way that I think activists and donors saw him. And I think that there's a pretty clear line between that and the fact that in his first, I guess it's not technically a State of the Union, but whatever the address to Congress was, that line where he's like, I want to tell the trans teenagers that the president has your back, or whatever that line was. The fact that Joe Biden, Catholic sort of traditionalist Joe Biden would say that in his first speech to the country as president, I think grows out of the fact that he sees this as a much bigger part of his identity now because of what was basically a slip up in May of 2012.
There's so many great stories like this that are all through this book. That's why it took you 10 years.
Yes.
To get through it all. So
and it took you only 9 to read it. So yeah.
So we have time for a few questions,
Great.
Eugene. So I just want to tell everybody, we have a lot of people on Zoom because we are still, if you're watching this tape, we are still in a COVID world. And so when someone asks a question, we have to repeat it from here. So if you have a question, we can repeat it.
Yeah, I have a microphone
right back here.
Thank you. Ooh, that's great. How aggravated was Obama himself with Biden after Biden's slip up? I mean, I know Valerie Jarrett,
Yeah,
the loyal Obama staff was like, "Oh, it's Biden screwed us again with a mistake." How do you know how?
yeah. I mean, my understanding is that they talked about it and Obama expressed his disappointment, but my understanding was that I think Obama's a pretty contained guy, and that people felt protective of him more than he lashed out at. I think he was more forgiving of Biden on this in the kind of it's Joe being Joe type way than staffers were, who probably, and part of it's like, you're a staffer, you spend a whole lot of time, I write at some length about like they spent 9 months trying to figure out how and when he's going to do this. And so I think like some of it is like, yeah, you screwed the boss, and some of it's probably, even if they didn't say this, is like, we did a lot of staff work to get this right, and you just like, spouted off about it. And I wouldn't surprise me if that's like, oh my God, how many meetings did we just go through to do this?
when the mass did judicial court was October?
November 22. they became law in 2000. Yeah.
Did the switch from sort of like 3 years ago civil unions to suddenly the first marriages going out, did that sort of like kill the momentum of like using the civil union as like a moderate tool? Like, well, you know, I'm not supportive of same-sex marriage, but I do support civil unions because, you know, it wasn't really an incremental change suddenly. Suddenly the discussion became, there's marriages now, so we're either going to get married or we're not. Is that a thing that really sort of happened? I mean, obviously it became about banning marriage when it came to the federal marriage amendment. Did Mass sort of shift the discussion, shift the paradigm from sort of this like slow movement through civil unions?
Yeah. And so let me repeat the question, right? Should I? Yeah. Okay. A very good question about how the Vermont legalized civil unions in 2000. 3 years later, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court orders town clerks to begin marrying gay couples. What is the interplay of those things, and how did legalizing marriage affect the sort of incrementalist civil unions path? I mean, so the civil unions, weren't anybody's goal to begin with, right? So the Hawaii case, they win in the courts, they sort of lose it in the legislature with the constitutional amendment. The Vermont case is the next one that gets filed in the summer of 97, and they're suing for marriage rights. And what happens is in December of 1999, the Vermont Supreme Court rules that under that equal benefits clause I mentioned of the Vermont Constitution, that the state cannot discriminate in the awarding of equal benefits to gay couples vis-a-vis straight couples. But the court says to the legislature, that does not actually mean that you have to let these couples marry. You guys can figure out some other way to give them equal benefits. And the legislature ends up over the next 6 months doing basically the minimum that it looks like the court will accept, which still ends up being more recognition than gay or lesbian families have gotten anywhere else in this hemisphere at this point, which is this new institution called civil unions. That term is basically created in this debate in 2000. And it is, marriage, all the rights and benefits of marriage under a different name. Same way, they say same way to get in, same way to get out. So ending a civil union is basically like getting divorced. Same, everything's the same except the word. And it ends up becoming an appealing position for, I think, moderate, ambitious Democrats to take. Basically this two-sided issue, or you support marriage equality or oppose marriage equality, becomes a three-sided issue. Now there's this other option. And for Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Howard Dean, John Lynch, basically every national or ambitious Democrat over the course of that decade stakes out that same position and says some version of the same thing, which is, I believe marriage is between a man and a woman, but I think that gay and lesbian couples should be entitled to all the same rights and benefits, and that's why I support civil unions, but don't think we should redefine marriage. And opponents of civil unions argue that it's a separate but equal institution that, by its very nature, distinguishes and discriminates. And so there's a real focus in the Massachusetts case on not giving the court an out to do anything short of legalizing marriage. And so what you see is a lot of the Hawaii and Vermont cases are about the discrete rights and benefits under state law that are afforded to gay and lesbian couples. The Massachusetts case is far more about the symbolic meaning of inclusion, what marriage represents, with the idea that no other word or institution can convey the same cultural meaning that marriage does. And so it takes longer than I think your question implies for that to take hold. I still think in the mid 2000s, there was a sense that civil unions or domestic partnerships would be the kind of incremental way station on the path to marriage. And there were some really active there's some really difficult decisions. So in 2005, the Connecticut is about to pass there had been a marriage bill. There aren't the votes to pass marriage. Passes a civil unions bill. Jody Rell, who's a Republican governor, will sign it. She's opposed to gay marriage, but would have signed a civil union bill. And the gay rights activists in Connecticut have to decide: are we going to endorse this? Throw our weight behind it, or are we going to encourage the kind of pro-LGBT legislators, mostly Democrats, to vote against a civil unions bill that can pass because, is it the equivalent of voting for segregated schools if the choice is no schools, right? And they end up reluctantly supporting civil unions. But so this just gets the full weight of the movement. I think it's not, what you start to see is you see states, not just Massachusetts, but other states go straight to marriage without going through civil unions. And then the big shift in the politics of this becomes, by 2010, the people who are running campaigns on this in states realize that public opinion saying like 2010, 2011 is roughly across the US, like 42% of the country supports same-sex marriage. Roughly a third of the country, I think, is like basically anti-gay and opposes a whole bunch of gay rights measures at this point, marriage among them. Then the other third or so in the middle are people who support civil unions. They're fundamentally sympathetic to gay rights. And I think they have become conditioned, hearing from gay rights groups, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, whoever, that you can give gay and lesbian couples everything that they're asking for without having to reckon with this,
And nothing gets taken away from you.
Nothing gets taken away from you. You can give it to them, and we also don't have to reckon with the complicated religious meanings of marriage. And ultimately, what the people who are running these campaigns realize is the thing that's stopping gay marriage from getting to 50% in that scenario is not that we have to go win over a bunch of people who are opposed to recognizing gay and lesbian families. That would be really tough. We just have to go and convince some of the people who think civil unions are a fully acceptable substitute for marriage that they're not. And so a lot of the campaigning that's taking place becomes converting civil union supporters to marriage. And at that point, you start to get clear majorities for marriage. And that's part of what makes Obama realize a year later, 2011, that being just a supporter of civil unions is out of lockstep with what has become a majority of people, or starting to be close to a majority who support marriage.
I think we have time for two more.
Yeah.
We've got one from Zoom. One of our Zoom people is.
A lot of people on Zoom are asking a similar question to this. The question is, are there lessons to be learned for other civil rights movements similar to what happened with the LGBT movement?
Yeah, so this is a question that I think like everybody in certainly issue politics is asking now, definitely in sort of lefty advocacy, is everybody's hoping that there's some like off the shelf, here's how to have a successful social movement thing out of this. And, people who do immigrant rights or gun control or climate is all like, can we get the secret formula for the marriage thing and apply it to our movement? And I think there are a lot of reasons why this is different than other movements, and people who probably think that you can directly apply things are often gonna get it wrong. But I think there are a few like big lessons here that are important. One is eventually the gay rights movement built structures that were focused on just winning marriage as opposed to advancing LGBT rights. So the big national organizations you've probably heard about, the Human Rights Campaign, the National Lesbian and Gay Task Force, they were founded in the 1980s to serve a whole community movement. And we should acknowledge, the LGBTQI plus movement community is a coalition. It's a coalition of people who have some shared interests. If the Equality Act were to pass Congress, which would write sexual orientation and gender identity into civil rights laws, that would benefit, the entirety of that coalition. But there are certain issues that only some parts of that coalition have an interest in. You know, in the 1980s, you look at family law issues, you know, basically gay and lesbian family law in the 1980s was the province of women. The concern was women who had been in heterosexual marriages, had children, come out of the closet, leave their marriages, then have to go to court to fight for the right to their own biological children. At the same time, AIDS was overwhelmingly a concern for the men in the movement. There were not women who were throughout the 1980s, I believe. I don't think there was a single woman who contracted AIDS through sexual contact in the United States. So this was a coalition that, you know, they worked together on some things, but they all also had very different priorities. And we talk about marriage, and, you know, I've used the term LGBT a bunch here. You know, let's note that like bisexual and transgender people were often able to marry the person that they loved, regardless of what the laws were in a given state. And often, I think people, what happened through the 90s and 2000s was that the big gay rights organizations nationally and in the states often did not make a priority out of marriage, mostly because they thought it was unwinnable, because they thought it was creating a big fight on this big goal when they could get more incremental gradualist success somewhere else. And I think a lot of those calculations were very sensible. If you're the Human Rights Campaign and you have a big coalition to serve and a whole lot of issues, you know, the way they were thinking about this on the Defense of Marriage Act is like, yeah, we could go like try to make a lot of threats to, you know, moderate Democrats to vote against this thing, but you know, a lot of them were just kind of listening to us on hate crimes laws, and we even get some moderate Republicans who listen to us on hate crimes law. Why are we going to pick a dumb fight with them on this thing we can't win to if we're going to jeopardize our relationship on this other thing?
And then Bill Wentz comes along.
Yeah, I mean, but when you
didn't
start,
get the memo.
right. But like what happens with the organizations is that all of a sudden, you know, you have a bunch of donors who decide marriage is a priority, and you have some activists who say, we're not going to get where we need to be as long as we're one of a bunch of things on the menu. And we need to create organizations that just have marriage as a goal. And so this group called Freedom to Marry relaunches in 2009. All the stuff I was talking about in New York and then in New Hampshire that the Republican donors were involved with was going through Freedom to Marry. And they said, we just have one goal. They said, you know, we're not an organization that's going to go on forever, like basically every organization. Our goal is to get marriage in 50 states and the District of Columbia. And then we're going to put ourselves out of business. And everything we do is focused on marriage, not on, you know, ending Don't Ask, Don't Tell, not on trans rights, not on employment non-discrimination. You know, they supported all those causes, but that's not what they did. And so, you know, one example of what happens when you have a singularly focused movement is, so the question is that I didn't get to in the long answer about Joe Biden is like, why was Joe Biden being asked on some random Sunday in May of 2012 what his position on gay marriage was? There wasn't a bill coming to the president's desk. There wasn't an executive order. The vice president has nothing to do on this. It was because in February of 2012, Freedom to Marry started a petition campaign. And their goal was to change the Democratic Party platform at that summer's convention. Now, party platforms are this kind of vestigial thing that they still mostly do at conventions that I think a lot of people think are silly because nobody reads them and why do we care anymore? But the folks who are doing this work for Freedom to Marry thought this is a way for us to pressure Democratic elected and party officials on our issue by forcing people who aren't necessarily having to take a vote in Congress on it or sign a bill in their state house to commit to our position on this. And we can use as a point of leverage against them. And so they start on Valentine's Day 2012, this petition drive called Democrats Say I Do. And they collect a bunch of signatures, and then they get some former Democratic National Committee chairs to endorse this at the launch, saying they think that the Democratic Party should now change its position on the issue. Okay, so now the DNC chairs have said that they want to change this. So Antonio Villaraigosa, who's the co-chair, the honorary co-chair, whatever, of the convention that summer, the mayor of Los Angeles at the time, says he supports it. And then Nancy Pelosi, who is like the gavel wielder or whatever the title is at the convention, she can't let the mayor of Los Angeles be to the left of her on this, so she now comes out and supports it. So now all of a sudden you have the Democratic leader in the House says that she supports changing the party's platform to support gay marriage. All of a sudden, media and activists are asking other Democratic members of Congress, do you agree with the speaker that the party should change its platform? Activists are going to random senators. Do you think that the party should change its platform? All of a sudden, this becomes a story that has its own momentum. Whether somebody says yes or no to this is now, do you agree or disagree with Nancy Pelosi? And it rises up to the level where cabinet officials are being asked, do you, the Secretary of Education, agree that the party should change its platform? And that gets this issue that was not an active policy issue at the federal level, enough into the news that a producer at Meet the Press thinks, hey, why don't we throw this in front of the vice president and see if he has anything new to say about it? And that was driven by activists who were not, if they had been serving the coalition or community broadly, they would never have done this because they wanted Nancy Pelosi to move a non-discrimination bill through the House the next year. And why would they try to put her on the spot? They wanted the White House to support an executive order requiring that government contractors sign a non-discrimination policy. Why would we unnecessarily antagonize cabinet officials when we want this? Like, all the calculations were such that you would never start a stupid petition drive to change a symbolic thing that's not going to get you any change unless you were just concerned with moving on that issue, in which case you did it and you saw the effect of it.
So we got time for one last, Ryan.
Hi, so my question is basically why America? Like you've said a few times throughout this that developments that have happened within the US were really like the first that have happened in this hemisphere outside of like a few small things in these small European countries that we don't care that much about here, frankly. So like with the evangelical streak that America has, why did it end up going the way it did so early compared to the rest of the Western world?
That's a great question. And just for all of our Dutch viewers on Zoom, I think very highly of your country and I care deeply about what happens there. So I think there's a way. So right now, 30 countries around on Earth out of 200 or so legalize same-sex marriage. There's a way to look at in terms of like the who was first that makes the US look really fast or really slow. We're one of, if you look at where are the first places that gay and lesbian couples in the world can marry, the US was very early because there were couples that were marrying in Massachusetts in 2004. And if you look at which countries legalized same-sex marriage, we're pretty slow because it wasn't until 2015 that all 50 states could. And so part of that is just the unique nature of our federalist system, which is that every European country I know about, and Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, the other countries that have legalized marriage, this was done at the national level through legislation, in a few places through court decisions, in Ireland and Australia through a popular vote of the people. There wasn't really a natural mechanism for that to happen in the US. And so I think it allowed, because we have, 50 states with very different politics, with their own constitutions, with basically insulated state judiciaries, you could have this almost system of experimentation. Nobody set out necessarily to say, let's use Massachusetts as the laboratory on this, but we had this example where, Vermont had civil unions, there was, America lived with that for a few years, and then Massachusetts had marriage, and then another state had marriage, and then another state had marriage. And if we'd been forced as a country through whatever mechanism to have to decide this at once for the whole country, I think it would have been a lot more difficult than the sort of gradual acceptance that was showed. And that ultimately, when the Supreme Court stepped in, it was already, a vast majority of the US population was living in places where same-sex marriage was legal, where there hadn't been significant backlash, and it was a matter of sort of smoothing out the sort of outliers in a way, more than it was about forcing a whole country to move at once. Where I think, a few things I would point out, a similar thing has happened elsewhere in this hemisphere. I think Canada did this at the provincial level first before it went a federal decision in Ottawa. Mexico did this also state by state. Brazil similarly did the state by state, and probably in all of these, at least in Mexico and Brazil, also religiously conservative countries and slightly different traditions, that probably made it easier to get to a national consensus on this. And so, I think that the US, I don't know if the US was, what I think we have seen though is the US has informed the campaigns just because of the amount of money that is spent on politics, and as a result, the sophistication of the political research that was done to figure out how you talk about this issue, how you build campaigns. A lot of that has been exported to other countries. I remember I was going to interview this woman, Thalia Zapatos, who's a character in the book who did a lot of the sort of innovative research about messaging. And I was going to see her in 2016, I think, for the first time to talk about work she'd done years earlier in the US. And she was flying back and forth to Ireland at that point because she was advising this ballot, this referendum there, because at this point hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on these types of campaigns in the US, and she'd probably been up close to more research on how you move people on this. Mary Bonato, who's one of the heroes of this book, who filed the case, who was a co-counsel of the case in Vermont, and then won the Massachusetts case and filed the first major DOMA case, and ends up arguing Obergefell before the Supreme Court. I went to see her in office at one point in Boston, and she was, I think, just about to go to Japan because there were a group of lawyers in Japan who were trying to develop a legal strategy for bringing marriage cases, and they wanted to hear from the American example. So I think even if we weren't first on this, there are a lot of ways in which US expertise is being exported. The flip side of that is that a lot of the folks who lost this debate have gone on to be involved in anti-gay politics, especially in Africa, but in large parts of the world where I think there's still twice as many countries on earth where basically gay sex is criminalized as there is countries where gay couples can marry. And so a lot of this fight is playing out in other countries where it was decades ago in the US.
Sasha, this has been great. I think you painted your masterpiece with this book. 10 years in the making,
thank you.
But there's not a fact that's not in there. And this has been great. And we really appreciate you coming.
I'm really glad to be here, Neil.
And
Thank
we'll
you.
See you during the presidential
I
cycle.
can't wait. Yes.
Thank you.
I won't have to go to Iowa this year, probably. So
Thank you.
more time here. Thank you.